Welcome. You found the psychic and the pastor. I'm the pastor, and well, this lady that's sitting back here in Virginia, close to Washington D.C., she's not a psychic, but she used to be. Marcia Montenegro. Welcome, Marcia.
Hello. Hello, Pastor Kent. Thanks for having me on your program.
Oh, I'm so glad. I think this is our sixth program.
Wow.
Yeah.
We've done several.
We've done a bunch, and so that's good. And now the subject is astrology. And of course, you know nothing about astrology, I'm sure. No.
I know a few things.
Yeah. Marcia, by the way, was an astrologer for a long time. Marcia, how did you get interested in astrology?
I don't remember exactly how it started, but I did read the horoscope columns in the newspaper. I was very interested in Jean Dixon, who at that time wrote horoscope columns for the major newspapers in the country. And I was interested in her. I think I read a book about her, an article about her that intrigued me. And I wanted to know more about this because I thought, if you know astrology, if you know these zodiac signs and what they mean, it can help you figure people out. And so I think that was one of the things that drew me. Also, it was not what most people in fact, nobody around me was interested in astrology. I was the only one, and my family definitely was not. And so that made me, I guess I felt like I had a unique interest that wasn't like everybody else's. And in college, I had been reading a little bit about it. I didn't know that much, but I knew enough to know the 12 signs and what they stood for. And so some of my friends would come to me once in a while and ask for advice. Like I had a friend who liked a guy, and she would come and say, well, I'm a Pisces, and he's a Virgo. Are we going to get along? Are those signs compatible? So I got those kind of questions, and I would answer. And then later, much later, after I got out of college, I had already started a spiritual path in college with an interest in Eastern religions, and I had an interest in the paranormal in high school. And I pursued those two areas for several years, getting involved with some groups and teachings before I actually studied astrology. But I started taking astrology classes. Actually, I started reading astrology books on my own. Then I took some astrology classes. This was in Atlanta, Georgia. And I was taking the classes. You have to learn the mathematical calculations to compute a chart, which I have to tell you, math is my worst subject, and I absolutely hate math. So this was a real challenge. But this also shows how much I wanted to do it, that I, learned the math. Then we studied the meanings. And in Atlanta, they had this thing set up where you could take an exam. And you had to pass the exam to qualify for a business license. And if you practice in the city limits of Atlanta, you had to have a business license or they could fine you. So I wanted to get the business license, and I did pass the exam. I got my business license. I started off very slow with people here and there, but it gradually built up. I was involved with the Atlanta Astrological Society, and it really became a big focus of my life. I mean, because I saw this as my calling.
Wow. So what sign were you? What's your sign?
Oh, I never tell because I don't want people to label me with that.
Okay.
And, some people know my birthday, so they would be able to figure it out, but that's okay. It's not that most Christians probably wouldn't label me, but there are so many Christians who think there's something to astrology. And of course, non-Christians would start labeling me, and then they would evaluate what I say based on that.
Okay.
And they would say, oh, that's probably why she thinks that. It's because she's a blah, blah. And that's one of the big dangers of astrology. And you start labeling people and seeing them through that filter. So I just don't say in interviews. I hope that's okay.
Marcia, I knew you were going to say that.
Oh, okay. Oh, I guess you must be the psychic.
I've had people ask me, well, Kent, what's your birth date? When were you born? And they would come back and tell me stuff about how I'm supposed to be or how I am. I've had that happen to me, and so I just laughed it off, And I always pigeonholed astrology as very distinct from astronomy.
Yes,
not the same thing, but a lot of people get confused.
Yes.
But it was even before I was a Christian, I knew that was crazy stuff.
Yeah, there are a lot of skeptics, and at the same time, there are a lot of people fascinated by it. One of the things about astrology, people who really like it and get in it, I have dealt several times with people who have contacted me who have become Christians. They're usually pretty new Christians. They were involved with astrology, and they tell me they were having a hard time letting go of it. They say, I have a really hard time letting go of this. It's like they want to still believe it, even though they know it's wrong, and they're really struggling. Now, praise the Lord, I did not have that issue, but it is a problem with some people because it just kind of has this hold on you, and it seems so true when you believe it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I can see that because in almost any kind of horoscopes, I want you to tell us about horoscopes in a minute. Some of it's going to relate to you, or it's going to be something that you're hoping for, and so you want to believe it.
Yes, exactly. Yes, that's true.
You just want that, and it sort of gives you a special knowledge. You think that you're carrying around a special knowledge.
Yes, special knowledge.
Horoscopes. Tell us about horoscopes, Marcia. What are they?
Okay, well, to answer that question, let me briefly say what an astrologer does, because a horoscope is kind of like a watered down form of astrology.
Okay.
And a lot of astrologers would even say a horoscope is not really astrology. They look down on it. But astrology, for an astrologer, is that you calculate the position of the planets and the sun and moon at the time and place of birth. And that's put in a 360-degree circle. And so you have, depending on the time and place, you have the sun over here, maybe the moon's in the 9th house, maybe Venus is in the 1st house. And then the 12 zodiac signs are scattered around the chart in order. So you might have the sun in Aries in the 4th house, let's say, which is the house of Cancer. And all of that has to be put together and interpreted by the astrologer. It's incredibly complicated. And one of the things I tell people is the occult is actually very complicated and complex, because that's one of the ways it draws people in. And because it seems it's so complex, people equate that with profundity and wisdom. And they think, oh, look at all of this, all this knowledge and all of this information that you have to really learn and dig out. And then there's more and more and more, and you never stop learning. People think, wow, this is like, the wisdom of the ages. That's how it affected me. And so it's actually like very complicated. When I did charts for people, it was at least an hour that I was talking to them.
A couple of things I've noticed when studying astrology is they refer to it as a pseudoscience. It seems scientific, the complexity, and it adds to the lore of it. Wow, look at how complex this is. It must be authentic, must be right, but it's termed by real scientists as pseudoscience.
Yes, and I think a lot of people think there's something to it also, because you do have to use math to calculate the chart, and it is the position of the planets that are in certain constellations. Now, of course, that's from the Earth's viewpoint. That's not necessarily where they are. If you're on Mars or something, or on the sun, it's going to look very different. So it's from the Earth's viewpoint, and also the most astrologers today use what's called the fixed zodiac belt. And actually, because of this technical thing called the precession of the equinox, where the North Pole gradually shifts its orientation towards constellations, it shifts enough that in 2,000 years' time, it moves several degrees, so that the dates you see in the horoscope column, like, maybe December 21st to January 20th or whatever it is, actually are backwards. In other words, you are likely the sign before the sign the newspaper says. So like you may think you're a Taurus and you're actually an Aries, or you may think you're a Leo and you're actually a Cancer. That's true for maybe about 2/3 of that particular sign, that it's actually shifted backwards. But the way astrologers know this, but the way they see it is, but the way that it was devised and when it was taught and all this knowledge came through it, we just keep it that way because symbolically that's still the truth.
Now, I noticed a little phrase, the retrograde of Mercury.
Yes.
Now, and that's supposed to be a big deal. The retrograde, what does that mean?
Okay, planets all the planets, I think all of them go retrograde at some point. And what it means, and it's really an astronomical term, that it has to do with technicalities of the Earth's orbit around the sun. And at certain points, it'll appear that it's going backwards. It's not really going backwards, but for a time, it will appear to go backwards. And of course, with the outer planets that move so slowly, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, they will be retrograde for long periods of time. Mercury, which is the fastest moving planet, will be retrograde for a shorter period of time. But Mercury in astrology is the planet of communication, the planet of contracts. When you sign things, you are doing it kind of under the Mercury rulership. So you're not supposed to, for example, buy a car or sign a lease or buy a house if Mercury's retrograde. Because if Mercury's retrograde, that means communication is not clear, or it's messed up, or you'll misunderstand things and you'll make a mistake. So astrologers, it's very famous that astrologers would say, I completely got that wrong on the test because Mercury's retrograde. So, they'll use that all the time, or be careful, Mercury's retrograde, don't sign the lease. And I actually one time was looking at a place to rent, and Mercury was retrograde. And I told the landlord, I said, I do want this place and I'll give you the money, but can I sign the lease in 2 days? Because I was going to wait till Mercury wasn't retrograde. He agreed. I can't remember if I told him, and so I didn't sign it till after Mercury was was not retrograde.
Now, where the knowledge, all this and that for the various Leo, Cancer, whatever, where does that come from? How did that appear? How did that develop?
Well, that came actually. Greece, in its later years, when it was becoming more influenced by foreign ideas, was influenced by the Arabs, and they got astrology from the Arabs. Now, how the Arabs got it and developed it, I don't know. I don't know if anybody knows that. But the Greeks adopted it, and they had the planets. I think they already had the planets named after their gods, and they correlated the planets to those gods, of course. And the Greeks were the first people to use astrology for individuals. Now, before that, we see astrology mentioned, in the book of Daniel. Astrology may be the oldest occult art in existence. It's very possible. It goes so far back. But astrology at that time was only for rulers and kings. And it was almost more, as far as we know, it was almost more of an omen kind of thing. Like the advisor to the king would see the planet Mars maybe getting near the sun, and he would tell the king. And the Mars, for some reason, stood for war, or was connected to the god of war, I think, in Babylonian gods. So that would mean that war was coming, or somebody was going to attack the kingdom. So it was almost more of an omen kind of thing. And I don't really know if anyone knows the exact history of astrology, because it's not really written down. You just have to look at documents that were written by people that believed in it. And it did change over the centuries. But the first people to use it for individuals were the Greeks. And of course, Rome adopted the Greek gods and gave them Roman names, and they adopted astrology. And so the names we have are from them. And the same ideas that the Greeks and Romans had, like Aries is for war, and Aries is ruled by Mars, and Venus is a planet of love and relationships. Okay, that's all part of the Greek Roman, belief in their gods and what they stood for. Jupiter was the ruler, the king, because of course at that time they hadn't, Saturn was the limits, and so he was actually kind of a planet of death. They didn't know about Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto until the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries.
Yes. So astrology forms around 7 planets instead of the 9 that we know now. Yeah.
Yes, for a long time, until Uranus was discovered in, I think, 1781. For some reason, I remember that. And that was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And so Uranus was connected to invention, revolutionary changes in society. It's also connected to rebellion. And it's the ruler of Aquarius, and now we have entered or are entering the age of Aquarius according to astrology, which could be a whole other show. I've actually done programs just on the age of Aquarius.
And so they saw that the hip thing was really a whole astrological kind of movement, and the stars are all in the right place, and
it was really part of the culture to a certain extent.
Now, let me go back, Marcia, to the horoscopes.
Okay.
And before you do that, I'm going to do this. I'm going to read 2 horoscopes. 2 horoscopes. And then you got to tell us what a horoscope is, because I'm really not quite sure. Okay.
No.
Okay, I'm going to read Leo. July 23, August 22. Slow down. Take time to go over documents and make changes that will save you financially. Looking at the big picture will help you recognize what you can do to make your life run smoothly. Okay, now that's Leo. This is the IJ. Now this is the San Francisco Chronicle. Different person altogether. It says, although you are inclined to work alone or behind the scenes now, today you have strong opinions about banking issues and anything that must be divided. Tonight, take stock. Well, they say entirely different things.
They do, although they both mentioned financial. One mentioned financial and the other, it was similar.
Yeah.
It was similar. And I think that's because, a horoscope column is written, if it's daily, it's written each day for each of the 12 signs. And I think it's usually based on the movement of the moon. And then they will also consider the faster moving planets like Mercury, Venus, and maybe Mars. And they look at those and what signs they're in and how they might impact. So they're looking to write for Aries, or let's say here in this case, Leo. So they'll look and see where the moon is on that day, where is Mercury, where's Venus, and then they'll write something up. So it sounds to me, because of the 2 things there, that there was something connected with money. So it might be that the moon was possibly maybe at that time in Taurus, which would have to do with finances, possibly, or there was something going on with Venus with those 2 signs. Venus rules Taurus. Now that's just a guess, but see, that's how it works. And then of course you can have weekly horoscopes and you can have monthly horoscopes.
Okay, so how this all worked kind of developed over the centuries, I suppose.
Yes.
And various characteristics were given that there was no sacred document found that said this. There was no anointed holy man that came along.
No.
There was none of that. It was just sort of a lore that developed over a long period of time, and so it settled in. and without any, as I say, it's pseudoscientific, without any real proof. And
Right.
once you start believing in it, you can kind of tailor what you do according to the sign. Like you're not signing that document; you had to put it off for 2 days.
Right, and that is more of a that would be something maybe that would be this kind of advice given maybe in a horoscope column or maybe by an astrologer for a particular narrow time period. But the way modern astrology, contemporary astrology, the way it's very different from astrology, let's say before like maybe 1900, is that with the advent of psychology, psychology had a huge influence on astrology. And instead of being fatalistic, so that the astrologer would look at the chart and say, oh, you're going to marry a cold man who won't love you and, you know, he's just going to be very strict, et cetera, et cetera. And it would change to, you're going to attract men who might be like your father, or they might be cold to you, or, you know, you're going to attract people that are detrimental to you because of patterns in your past. So you need to be aware of this. And the whole idea is that if you know these potential things, you can change them. So it's not as fatalistic as it was before. And that made it more appealing, of course, to the contemporary person, because in our contemporary culture, we feel we do have choices and we can have some kind of control, you know, over our future. So it works along with psychology. And Carl Jung was a huge influence on astrology as well. I read books by astrologers who were Jungian psychologists.
Okay. Now, Marcia,
Yeah.
When it comes to, let's say we have a Christian person who is a Bible-believing individual, and they come across astrology, they're going to be not open to it, I would imagine. Have you run across people that are Bible-believing Christians who still embrace astrology?
Oh, yes. I have had so many Christians ask me when I've given a lot of talks in churches in 30 states, and I have been to various groups, and a lot of the times one of the most common questions I get is, well, isn't there something to astrology? Or if astrology isn't true, then why does my zodiac sign, why am I such a Gemini? You know, it really describes me. So if it's not true, then why does Gemini describe me? And which is really you can't give a quick answer to that, but there is an answer. And I have run into that. It's very common. Some Christians will ask me, is it okay to read my horoscope for fun? And my answer to that is, well, God takes astrology pretty seriously in the Bible, and he condemns it. Just read Isaiah 47, for example. The last few verses are about astrology, but God is pronouncing judgment on Babylon and all their occult arts. And just read that, and if God takes it seriously, and it's a pagan system opposed to God, then how can it be fun to read your horoscope? I think that pretty much ruins it for them. It's like, because, I mean, now every time they go to read it, they're going to think about what I said, I hope. Because, I mean, really, I'm just telling the truth. God takes it seriously. It's a practice of divination. It's occult divination. And God condemns that throughout the Bible.
Exactly right. Horoscopes have to be flattering, or, you know, they have that tendency to be that way. And you can kind of see that, you know, you're either going to follow Jesus or you're going to follow the horoscopes. You're going to believe,
right,
you know, one of the two, because
right.
They're really completely incompatible.
Yes.
I want to bring this up. I'm writing a book. One of my chapters is going to be on astrology, and I start off like this. Christ himself talked about the importance of astrology when he said in Luke 21:25, there shall be signs in the sun, the moon, and stars. He discusses with the disciples the importance of astrology and how it can be used as a sign of his return. Wow. So, so this is going to be at the beginning of my chapter on this, on astrology. Somebody is saying, okay, no, Jesus approved of it. I believe Jesus believed in astrology. Well, here's a passage in Matthew chapter 24, verse 29. Now here's what Jesus said. And this is a chapter of the last days. He says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the difficult days leading up to the return of Jesus, he says, in those days the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heaven will be shaken. Okay, this is what Jesus actually says. That's as close as, he's no believer in astrology. He's saying on the last day,
right,
on the day of the return of Jesus, it's going to be catastrophic. The universe is going to be incredibly impacted. And later you could go on, when you look in some passages in Peter, 1 Peter, that everything that exists will be dissolved, gone.
Yes.
Gone.
Yeah.
And so I like to point out that Christians need to know, and others need to know, that Jesus does not promote astrology in any sense.
No.
No.
Absolutely not. And all of the verses, I have seen all the verses used by Christians from the Bible that they think supports astrology, and none of them support astrology. I've done Facebook posts on almost all of them. References to Orion, references I think in Psalms where it says God knows the names of each star. That just means God created all the stars, and he knows, because we don't even know how many stars there are. That we don't even know how many galaxies there are because of the infinity, or seemingly infinity. It's not only God is infinite, but God is infinite. So he created this vast universe we can't see the end of. But God knows each star in all of the galaxies of the universe, and we don't even know how many there are. That just shows the awesomeness and majesty of God. Doesn't say anything about astrology there, but that's one of the most common verses people use to tell me that astrology has something to it.
Marcia, thank you so much. We've reached the end of another program.
Okay.
Wow, I wish you well in your work,
you.
Marcia.
Thank you so much.
It couldn't be this area, these areas that you deal with. Nothing could be more important today, because it's so many people falling into complete error as a result. All right, this is the end of the psychic, in this case the former psychic and the pastor. And you might want to go to milleravenuechurch.org, and you'll be able to look around and find the other programs that we've done with Marcia Montenegro. So until the next program, so long.